I'm Lauren Fisher with the National Museum of American Diplomacy, which is a part of the State Department, and I am delighted to be a part of this panel today, Simulating Diplomatic History, Introducing the Skills and Tools of Diplomacy Through Role Play. I am very happy to be accompanied by two of my very good friends and colleagues, Dr. Allison Mann, public historian with the National Museum of American Diplomacy, as well as Dr. Nate Sleater with the George Mason University's Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media. So welcome to everybody. I'm going to kick us off by sharing my screen so we can have a slide deck that has some images and words to sort of guide our conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and share that now, and then I will preside over the first sort of 20 minutes or so of our conversation. I'm gonna just move things around here.
And Lauren, I'm going to open up that question and answer tab to see if anybody has anything going on.
Right. Perfect. Thank you, Allison. So as we move through our conversation today, as Allison just said, we'll feel free to give us your thoughts and your questions in that question or Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. And we'll do our best to respond to your thoughts and questions. And certainly there's going to be time for an open conversation at the end of our session. So welcome. This is the beginning. Here we go. All right. So we are the National Museum of American Diplomacy. As I said, we're part of the State Department. I'm going to pause here so you can put up your phone, your camera to this QR code here, so you can go directly to our website, so you can check us out there. We are a museum whose mission is to tell the story of American diplomacy through our exhibits, through our programs, through our artifact collections, and through our education and outreach. So our mission is to help an audience better understand the work of diplomats, both at home and abroad. And in a way, it's kind of also helping to illuminate for our visitors the function of the federal government and how we engage in international relations. So that's kind of who we are. We are planning to build a permanent museum, which will be at the State Department. This is some sketches. We are working with some designers now. We have a full curatorial team, which includes Allison. And we're working on our permanent exhibits. We have over 9,000 objects in our artifact collection, which relate to, help us tell that story of diplomacy. And here are some sort of views of some of the future galleries that we will have in our exhibits. You see on what is to my left, those pillars where you see the word security, prosperity, development, and democracy. As we think about the goals of American diplomacy, we help to engage with the world by helping foreign audiences better understand who we are as the United States and who we are as Americans. And we sort of, our involvement is guided by these four themes or these four pillars: security, prosperity, development, and democracy. And so we use these four pillars as a way of helping to tell our story. And so in our future museum, sort of a lot of these stories are organized under that. So that just kind of gives you a peer into the future. However, in 2019, in 2019, we opened what we call a preview exhibit called Diplomacy is Our Mission in our beautiful pavilion space, which is on the 21st Street side of the State Department building in Washington, D.C. So here's a view of Diplomacy is Our Mission. And again, you see these four pods, what we call pods, these four enclosures that again are bringing into light those four pillars: security, prosperity, democracy, and development. And within each enclosure, and as you can see, there's an image on the top right, my right, that is actually me in one of those enclosures. And in that enclosure, we are highlighting 3 stories of diplomacy, exploring a past story, a diplomatic historical story, a current story of the practice of diplomacy, and a surprising story about what diplomacy is. And so this exhibit has really enabled us to sort of test drive some of the stories and concepts that we want to include into our permanent exhibit, and to start to begin to engage an audience. Now, the truth of the matter is although diplomacy is our mission, has helped to, in an exhibit space, just begin to work with an audience and get to know them through an exhibit and to hear their thoughts and their feedback. We've actually been working with students and teachers for 15 years. Um, I'm the director of education for the museum, and as we were beginning to conceptually design this museum about diplomacy, we wanted to quickly work with teachers and students. And a lot of our engagement really, as I learned in working with them, was really kind of very basic, because a lot of people were not clear about the role of the Department of State and what it was. So a lot of our programs really explore what that is. And the Department of State, it's a federal agency, part of the executive branch. Its function is to handle those international relations on behalf of the president. So this was very basic, but we learned right away that this is really an important piece of what our outreach and our engagement is sort of helping audiences to better understand what the State Department is. And then also to really think about, well, we understand what the State Department is. We understand now that diplomats work for the Department of State. There's embassies and there's consulates, but what is the nature of the work? What does it mean, and what is it about? So we really then started to just really look at this idea of what is diplomacy. And at the museum, we really think of diplomacy as that art and practice of building and maintaining relationships between countries. And it's also those skills that we use in working with people. So when we really started to think about, like, sort of, okay, the idea of the State Department and diplomats and this notion of diplomacy, really what came from really understanding that these were two essential pieces that our audiences really need to learn and explore, the diplomacy simulation program was born. And it's really, it's a simulation program, so it's a role play type program that takes a scenario common to all of those who are playing. Our simulation program is designed for a group between not in size, between 15 and 30 participants, so a classroom size. So we really wanted to develop something that a classroom teacher could integrate into their classroom teaching, whether they were in secondary school or post-secondary school. So it's taking a classroom size between 15 and 30 students, having them read a common scenario, and then with that group, breaking them up into smaller groups we call stakeholder groups representing a country. And then they could start to explore what the skills are of diplomacy and then work together as diplomats do to explore solutions to a global problem or a global issue. So by creating this kind of program, we were sort of introducing the idea, because the State Department was always a stakeholder at the table. We always, that was the intention of having the State Department as one. And it allowed us to sort of bring into focus the State Department, the diplomat, kind of giving students a sense of what their roles are, the skills involved, and then also this idea of a global issue and how our State Department or our government engages in a global issue. Really what we've come to learn out of our simulation program, we have 10 simulations. They are hypothetical. So State Department is a role at the table, but all other countries involved are hypothetical. The takeaway was really allowing students to explore sort of the nuances of diplomacy, the challenges, the patience involved, giving them a glimpse into this world. And we've had extraordinary success with this, more so than I ever actually set out to accomplish. We've been just amazed at the takeaways that students have been able to learn. What we have found is students might know about global issues. They might know about wildlife trafficking. They might know about environmental challenges that our global community faces. But what they're not clear about is how the State Department is involved in those solutions, or how diplomacy is a part of that. So these simulations really help to bring a lot of this into focus for our students. At the heart of the diplomacy simulation program, however, is really the skills of diplomacy. And there's a lot of these skills on this slide, but we've thought long and hard about these skills. We've tried to think about ways in which that we could make them unique to diplomacy, but at the end of the day, we have discovered that these are skills that are just great 21st century skills that all students need to learn and to kind of become aware of. These are skills that are beneficial in any situation you put a student or a person, whether it's in a personal situation or a work environment, certainly on the global stage. And we took some of our cues from what the State Department calls as the 13 dimensions. And this is something that the State Department has defined as when they look for what they look for in a diplomat, what skills they look for. So between sort of the skills of the 4 C's of creativity, communication, collaboration, and communication, sort of looking at those 4 C's that teachers are so aware of, as well as our 13 dimensions, we've kind of brought forth this list of how, when diplomats engage, what we look for: certainly composure, how they professionally represent themselves, even in a really difficult, challenging situation, how they're aware of all the different perspectives. And it's not just in perspectives on a problem, but rather what through culture and through language, how those perspectives can change. Where analysis comes into this, where you need to look at a situation objectively, not just subjectively. That communication, it's not just being able to articulate what you want, but rather asking good questions to help you understand what another stakeholder or another party wants. Managing time, managing skills is crucial. The creativity and the innovation of problem solving, we really encourage our students to use. And that where leadership comes into play, especially when groups or 2 particular groups may not be getting along, they've reached an impasse, where another party can come in and help kind of soften and create a pathway for solution. And of course, collaboration is at the heart of this, where you are, through all of these skills, trying to find that area of common ground and commonality. But the delicate balance of diplomacy in trying to work together is that last bit, which is advocacy. Because really at the heart of what our diplomats do is they represent the interests of the United States or the interests of the country that they may represent at the table. So you have those interests that you're representing at the center of it, but you're trying to work with others using all these skills to find a path to solution. So this is really at the heart. So when we talk about skills, this is what we're referring to. Now, as much as these skills may be applicable to any kind of job profession, what we've learned, it's really the tools that are unique to us as the State Department, or what diplomats do on an international stage. So we want to expose students to what these skills of diplomacy are. And we've really kind of created some categories here, which you see listed: communications, because certainly summits and meetings or one-on-ones are really important to creating that relationship. And of course, our simulations sort of bring people to the table. There's formal agreements, treaties. Today, we're going to talk about a simulation that is very much about how do we make a treaty, what goes into that, what's a formal agreement, where aid comes into that, and development. Development becomes a really interesting topic to describe with students, and how that can help build and maintain relationships with countries. Trade, of course, trade is, as one of our pillars would indicate, prosperity, trade, where that's really important to how countries come together. Military cooperation, what does that mean, and how countries kind of offer that kind of military support, military knowledge. And you see, I'm just going to move to the bottom, knowledge exchange, where you exchange with countries sort of the expertise and skills and ideas and information that can be certainly connected to that military cooperation. And of course, travel. State Department issues passports and visas, but it's also about, by traveling internationally and learning about different cultures and languages, how that sort of is a tool in understanding sort of this world. So we really like to introduce the tools of diplomacy, because as the State Department and diplomats, we are uniquely positioned to use these in building and maintaining those relationships. So as mentioned, we have 10 hypothetical simulations, which in May of last year, we now offer virtually. These are designed for a live environment where students are working with each other, not only around the table in formal meetings, but the way in which the program is designed, students have an opportunity to meet away from the table in sidebar conversations where they are self-organizing, trying to work together, and learning the difference between what is accomplished sitting at a table versus what is accomplished in private sidebar conversations. And their takeaways are right on point. It's protecting what you can say at a table where you have everybody listening, and you present your ideas in a different way than you might when you're away from the table. We train teachers to use these simulations in the classrooms. We offer them on site at the museum. I think what's made our diplomacy simulation so successful is on the website, diplomacy.state.gov. These are downloadable materials for free. And accompanying these materials, there are videos that allow you to, as a teacher, to learn how to integrate them into the classroom. So you don't need necessarily to take a training session with us. There are videos and there are guides that you can refer to learn about how to integrate these into the classroom. And with most of these hypothetical simulations, there are what we call subject matter expert videos. They're clips of diplomats who work on that particular issue. So in the case of our migration simulation, which is actually one of our most popular, there are clips of diplomats who work on this issue, and you can play those short clips for your students so they can have a better sense of that issue and how diplomats engage on that issue and the kinds of solutions and challenges that they may present. So that's on our website. This has really catapulted us into sort of the global ed arena. And yet when I will say that in helping us get these simulations on our website and tested with teachers and in classrooms, we engaged the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media in a partner with us. They've helped us draft these simulations. We worked alongside diplomats to make sure we had those scenarios just right. We test drove them in classrooms. We test drove them with community college and university students. So these are all tried and true simulations. We've had a blast. What has become, or what became sort of a deficit, if you will, is that I really felt that I needed to introduce some historical references into this teaching of diplomacy to be able to point to specific moments in history when either these skills or these tools were employed. And being that our museum will have a whole hall, if you will, dedicated to diplomatic history or the history of foreign affairs, it was really important for me that we had some simulations that helped students explore moments in history, to be able to begin to look at this, how skills and tools have changed over time in our history, and what diplomats use. The role of the State Department, how it's changed over time. So it was really important for me to be able to know that we had these historical sims, a part of our library that teachers could bring into the classroom, not just what is diplomacy and the skills, but also let's look at these moments in time and begin to realize that diplomacy was there in the beginning, and that diplomacy has helped shape this nation. Essentially, it's been a part of all parts of our American history. I think we realize that there's a lot of attention played in American history classes to wars and generals, and we really felt it was time for us to sort of put a focus on our history by looking at diplomacy. Um, I just want to also mention, I mentioned that our program has really helped us to gain attention within the global ed community. And then because in the global ed, you have sort of these ideas of the 21st century skills or the global competencies. And these simulations really fit beautifully into this model of how we prepare our students, not only for their own work environments, of how to work with others to solve problems, but also for them to think about how the world works together, and how these skills are really what are going to help um, different countries work together to face these big global issues that we all encounter. So that has been sort of really important in the evolution of this program. And that we connect beautifully into that National Council for Social Studies framework of how we think about the change over time of diplomacy, but also sort of how our role in the world has changed as well. So realizing that I needed to create some historical simulations, I quickly called some partners, reached back out to the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media and our friends there, and Nate, and said, Nate, I'm thinking of this idea. Would you join us in thinking about how to create 3 historical sims? And he said, of course. We went to our friends at National History Day that work with over 1 million students across this country in their National History Day competition, which starts on a local level, and then it builds out to a statewide level, and then those state winners move to a national competition. And each year they have a theme that grounds those student projects. And we thought with their partnership in this, we would have a winning product. And then we went to the Una Chapman Cox Foundation and presented them with this idea of what we would like to do. And the Una Chapman Cox Foundation is a foundation that exists to help those in the United States better understand the Foreign Service and those diplomats that work for us abroad, and to raise awareness, as not only for the sake of raising awareness, but also to help build a diverse Foreign Service that represents the whole of the United States. And so they have a great mission. And so they were on board and they gave us the money. And so then we launched our project, which is the historical diplomacy simulation program. And so thank you for joining us. So what I'd like to do now is ask my friend Nate to the screen. And Nate, I know when I presented you with this idea, you were all on board, but then it was like, oh, okay, but how do we begin? Where do we start? And how do we approach kind of taking that hypothetical simulation model that allows a teacher to use this product in their classroom in like a 2-hour period? How do we bring that flexible simulation model to a historical moment? And so I let Nate chew on that problem for a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks everyone for joining us here. This was a very fun and exciting project to work on and to be working on. A little bit about my background is that my personal background, I'm a K-12 teacher, a former K-12 teacher. Taught middle school, high school, special education and history. I went back to get my PhD in history, and now I work with teachers both in professional development settings and in creating online resources to support history education. And in that capacity, I really have come to see simulations as this double-edged sword for teaching history. The pro part of it is that teachers and students absolutely love them. They're super enthusiastic about using simulations and role plays. Teachers are enthusiastic. When I do professional development courses online and in person and have teachers come up with their own activities, a large number of them are going to be kind of historical role plays. And as a teacher, I know the reason that teachers love these is they get students engaged. They get students up and moving and enthusiastic about the topic. So there's a lot to be said for that, and there's a lot really positive about that. When I put on my historian hat, which I won't call like the grumpy part of myself, but it can be grumpy, I see them also having some pitfalls, because simply pretending to be someone from the past doesn't necessarily help you understand them, right? It can be part of a process for sure, but it's not inherently something that helps you understand the past. So what can happen if the simulation isn't sort of framed correctly or framed in the best way possible for students is that, at best, students come away with a misunderstanding about what happened in the past, because they chose all these things and they found out that people in the past didn't choose those things. So why didn't they? And they don't really, maybe make that connection. And then sometimes it's even traumatizing. It seems like we see these stories, every couple of months where someone reenacts something from slavery or the history of, Jim Crow segregation or something. And a lot of these historical crimes, these historical injustices just get reenacted in the classroom, and it's a negative experience for everyone. So super enthusiastic to do this in a way that will help students and teachers, because I know that the desire is out there and the need is out there for really good simulations. And there are many people who do it well, and we've done some others in the past, but it was good to kind of immerse ourselves in this. So even before I started, I thought, what are kind of my ground rules about creating something like this? What makes for a good simulation? And one rule is definitely you want a scenario with no dominant side, right? You want to make sure you have everyone can have some flexibility in terms of shaping the outcome of the scenario, right? Therefore, you want a scenario that has multiple plausible outcomes. There are just some moments in history where that really isn't quite the case. Having students, my point of view, the one I always bring up is pretending it's 1861 and you have the North and the South, right? And you do a role play like that. Well, it's unlikely at that point that there was going to be any kind of a compromise. It probably would have been a very distasteful compromise anyway. And in any case, students would come away with a pretty inaccurate picture of what happened before the Civil War. So finding a time period where other things could happen, there were possibilities, there were things that may have been an outcome but ultimately didn't happen, I think is what makes for a good historical simulation. And then within that, when you create it, you kind of need to have fairly clear boundaries. Those boundaries are going to be guided by the historical context. You don't want, teachers or students especially are very creative. And if given the license to do anything, they will absolutely come up with solutions that have no bearing on what the historical actors at the time ever would have thought of or ever would have did. And that doesn't really help anyone learn history. So we want to give the agency, we want to give the creativity, we want to give the choice, but we want to also balance that with understanding historical context. And I chose this cartoon because the students will take these role plays extremely seriously, and they will take it and run if you don't put some parameters on what's the best way to do it. So next slide. So to sort of determine those areas in history, determine those topics, we got together and we met in January of 2020. You might not believe this. I know it's incredible. We met in person. We were there, it was in person, indoors, around a table. It was incredible. Hard to imagine what that's like now. We'll probably get back there soon, hopefully, but that's what we did. And we had representatives from the National Museum of American Diplomacy on the education side, the history side. We had representatives from the Una Chapman Cox Foundation, including the head of that foundation, Ambassador Gutierrez. And we had Lynn O'Hara and Ashley from the National History Day, who have so many connections to teachers and have worked with teachers. So we had a wonderful group. And I think we very quickly, honed in on the consensus that we want to determine topics that teachers want, that teachers will use in the classroom, but are balanced and have that kind of good simulation potential. So it was a really fruitful conversation. And I think we started out with a list of, like 20 or 30 possibilities. And we fairly quickly narrowed them down to, I think, 5 or 6 that were reasonable. And then we went to the National History Day, went to teachers to get some input on which ones they thought would be most useful in the classroom, which ones they wanted to see. And through that process, and it was really, really productive, I think. And it would have been a far different experience for me if I was the one solely having to choose these topics to create simulations out of, but to get the feedback from just a variety of people who are professionals in public history, professionals in education, and professionals in diplomacy to really find that balance and to agree on what that balance should be was really useful and really, really helpful. So after that discussion, we settled on these 3 topics, which I'm really happy with, and each was really fun to work on. The Barbary hostages, which we're going to hear a lot more about, the kind of Spanish-American conflict. This is just before the Spanish-American War, and then the Suez Canal, which is got the Cold War theme. It's got Egypt as kind of a middle player there, France and Britain. So it's got a lot of these elements that I talked about in the initial. You've got no dominant side in any of these. Each of these could have had different plausible outcomes, very possibly if things went a little bit differently. And we just needed to then frame those so that students could make choices that were fun. They still had fun choosing. They still had the creativity to make it an engaging lesson. But at the same time, they also learned the history by having some parameters based on that historical context. So our final slide. So then the fun part came for me to research and write these simulations. But again, like I felt, if I was on a ship, like I had a great boost out to sea from getting the feedback on the topics and knowing, yes, these will provide a good grounding for students. These are great places to start. There's really plausible, and that's what I found too. Looking into the history further, looking into the historical context behind each one of these, they really did have these elements of really good simulations, and it was really exciting. And I was going to mention too, what's nice about this simulation setup when you talk about those kind of rules in terms of flexibility and also no dominant side. I mean, guess who's the most prominent in history when those situations arise? That's when diplomacy really matters, right? That's when the diplomats really are relied upon to advocate for their group or their country. That's when their skills really come to the fore, when things are up in the air and no one side is going to dominate through force. So it's really an exciting way to match the mission, I think, of the museum with the goal, the pedagogy of these lessons. So as I was researching them, the sort of the fun part then was finding, well, what are plausible concessions or asks from each of these groups in each of these situations? What might they have offered? Where are their red lines too? Where are there absolutely no-go lines? Because students do need those kind of parameters. They need those guardrails so that they don't go too far off to one side. But what could they offer? What could they, what else might they want that they didn't get? And so this is one example that I remember Allison and I were kind of emailing back and forth when we'd find sources talking about the Barbary pirates. Like, what are they talking about? What kind of things are they offering? And as I'm sure she'll talk about, where a lot of that involved possibly exchanging money. So money, 12,000 Spanish dollars. I think at one point we were looking up the conversion rate for Algerian sequins to see if we could have an idea of what that might have been in American dollars or Spanish dollars. But also, ship materials, because these Barbary states, what they really wanted out of this interaction was to build up their own navies. So they were on the lookout for the ability to fund that, but also the ability to construct things on their own. So they're looking for pitch and rosin and staves, and I had to look up what a stave was, barrels of tar and cables and linen for sails and things like that. So it's really fun to go back into the primary source documents and find what were the things that were actually being discussed, what might have been on the table, what could someone have asked for, but they didn't in a lot of these negotiations and simulations. And then the key after that, I think, was just making sure we wrote that in a very clear, accessible language, which I've experienced with as a teacher in creating resources for students of different ages, but just to make sure that all students could access and participate in these simulations was really important. And from there, what we did was, again, a lot of feedback. This is a very iterative and collaborative process throughout. We ran it by historians like Allison and others working at the State Department, offered hugely helpful feedback on each of the simulations. The National History Day put it out to teachers. We got wonderful feedback from teachers and students using it in the classroom. And then Lauren was there working with students and test driving them to make sure that it actually worked out there in the real world. And of course, had the curveball of having to do it virtually all of a sudden, which changed things up and mixed things up, but also I think adds to the potential for these simulations to be used in a variety of settings as well. So that's what I have. I'll turn it back over to Lauren.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Yeah, and I also just want to add, and it was a really fun process, and we're kind of still in it. These materials will not be complete until, or let me say it this way, these materials will not be on our website until June. So they'll be complete in June. But I want to add that we also had students give us their feedback as well. So after students played The Sims, and we did play with some college students as well, that they filled out like a Google form and they gave us some of their feedback, and we tracked all that, and we wanted to tweak and make sure that every stakeholder had what they felt that they needed to have, as Nate sort of suggested, sort of a level playing field, that everybody had something kind of going in to the sim. Awesome. And it's been a lot of fun, and we've been able to do it virtually. When we received the grant, as Nate said, when we kicked this thing off, that was in January of 2020. Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. So we did not lose any time on this, because we figured out how to take our regular diplomacy simulation program and we do them virtual through Zoom. And so we were just able to take that same model and test drive the Sims, thankfully so. So now, thank you. I'm going to invite our public historian, Dr. Mann, to the screen. And
hello. Yes, yeah. I actually wanted to take a pause for a second to see if there was any questions.
Perfect. You know what? I cannot see.
Yeah, you have to move
I can.
Down.
Yeah.
There's the Q&A tab.
You know what? Because I'm sharing my screen, so it's.
I can see the questions. There aren't any.
Okay,
but
cool.
I'll monitor.
Thank you. All right. Oh, whoops. So,
well, since you're sharing your screen, I might have to ask you what some of those words are, because I see the Zoom box to the right.
Okay, hold on. Let me see if I can hide video panel. Can you see it now?
No, but it's fine. We can just go through them, really quickly. So, because Lauren, I think that you set this up really well. You were creating a product that was really in response to what teachers were telling you, that they needed. They love the simulation program. They love the hypotheticals. They love the fact that the kids get engaged. But, they were also like, well, I've got this curriculum. Like, I got to figure out a way to get them engaged in kind of what I'm teaching. So, and then we thought, what do we have to offer to that? Because certainly you can find so many role-playing exercises. As Nate said, some of them are just, horrendous and should never be attempted. But, there are a lot of really good products out there where the students engage with primary sources. So how do we make it unique to the State Department, the role of diplomats, the skills that diplomats use? And so we very much wanted to infuse the Department of State in there, and just give people sort of an understanding what it is as a cabinet agency. Some secretaries of state, they're out there, they're really well known, they're like celebrities, right? But then you don't hear about some of them, so we never even quite know where somebody's coming to, if they even kind of understand the role of the State Department in the president's cabinet. And then also what a foreign service officer is, right? Like, how many times, Lauren, do you hear people say, like, well, are they foreigners? Right? What is a foreign service officer? And then we have to tell them they're people from the United States who go overseas and they promote diplomacy. So sometimes, like, that's how basic we sort of have to get. And So yes, engaging in that simulation, that's like a real historic event. And what was very important to me is to try to find events. And I remember, like Nate, I remember sitting around that that conference room last year, January of 2020, where we wanted to give the teachers things that would fit in the curriculum, but also maybe stuff that they don't get an opportunity to really dig into, because I don't know, when you got US History 1 and US History 2 to teach in 2 semesters, like you got to blow past, so much stuff that is actually really interesting. So we also wanted to give teachers an opportunity to just take a pause. This is actually a really cool moment in time. Like, let's just take a look at this. So we wanted to give them that. And of course, they need to understand that even though they might be in somewhat of an antagonistic, points of view, because you're right, Lauren, Nate, like kids kind of learn through wars, right? It's just like, it seems like the steady march of like the history between wars, Revolutionary War, Civil War, World War I, World War II. But, diplomats are there. They're there when the conflict starts happening. They're there to try to like tamp it down. They're there to promote the peace and prosperity of the United States of America, and, to do what they can. When the war starts, oftentimes they're still there, right? Like they're still trying to find a solution, even though the war has started. And then when it's over, they're there. They're the ones who have to negotiate the end to it. So the role of diplomacy and diplomats, even if you follow that rubric, is still wickedly important. And then, we wanted to give them to like these real world problems, right? So practical solutions to that. Is there a question in the chat? I don't know why it just popped up for me.
There is, and I'm going to answer it.
Oh, cool. Thanks. Then I just I'll let you do that part of it. Thank you so much, Nate. So let's move on to the next slide, Lauren.
Sure, if I can do this correctly. There we go.
Okay, so how do we decide on these Barbary hostages? Most of the time, this is not something that is talked about in the classroom, right? So teachers even have the time to really discuss it. They kind of teach it through the Barbary, wars, which were not like official wars because Congress in the early 1800s, never signed off on these. So these are during the Jefferson administration, right? And it's kind of funny. It's like, when you look at this period of time, often it's like, oh, George Washington comes down from the heavens and serves as the greatest president ever. And then along comes Jefferson, they buy up some land in the West and settlers go West and there's slavery and this terrible war. And now let's talk about the 20th century, right? So I've just given you in 10 seconds, kind of like what they're faced with. But we are planning on doing an exhibit about this Barbary hostage crisis of the 1790s in our museum. So this was something that was really on my brain. And when I say the museum, I talk about the permanent exhibits that we hope will be open in 2 or 3 years. And this is a moment of time. It's like a crisis flashpoint, right? That I think doesn't get that much attention. And then you got to like even get over the whole idea of the pirate situation, because everyone thinks, oh my goodness, Pirates of the Caribbean, the ride in Disney and the Johnny Depp and the this and the that and the Caribbean. No, like let's move you over to another part of the world. Let's really start thinking about the position of the United States during this time period. And Lauren, I'd like you to speak on this a little bit. Do you think that when we have students do these simulations, that there's a certain arrogance that comes when a student is assigned the United States, that they already feel that they've been given this mantle of power?
Oftentimes, yes. And I think in the hypotheticals as well. So in all of these simulations, I think when they get US as their designated role, and it's like, yes, because they feel like they've got this position and all the power and they can determine. But I think that's one of the important reasons why we chose this too, because it's kind of giving them the sense of like, you have to think of the historical context that you are in. And I think in all of our sims, that's, what we're really trying to offer our students is the backdrop to the history. And before you continue, I just also want to add, because Lynn O'Hara at National History Day loved the fact that we were doing this for that reason, because kind of looking at really what the United States had, and the power of position, or the position of power or not that they had. But also it's this notion of hostages, and that kids kind of find that like a little kind of interesting. She knows what kind of piques their interest. So even though there's these hostages involved, that kind of seduces the students to want to kind of learn more about what's happening here. And I think that was another reason why it's the pirates, but it's also the hostages, and sort of how can this be that they have some of our hostages, and that's such an assault. So it was a way of really kind of opening up these big things that are important to students, and to help them kind of really look at this time period.
Yeah, well, I think, I sat in that one simulation. I kind of watched how it fleshed out, and it was very interesting to see the students playing the United States, at that weakness, because in this whole scenario, in these players, these different stakeholder positions, the United States is at the weakest point. And I think the assumption is that everyone's going to come to the United States for the money. Everyone's going to come to the United States to broker agreements. That's not the case here. So, that was always first and foremost on our minds. So we chose these stakeholders to represent the real actors who would have been involved in the 1793, 1794 crisis. So just really quickly, backdrop for the audience. 1776, the United States Declaration of Independence. Hooray, we're free. Hurrah, we're independent. The British say, LOL, you're not. The French say, maybe you are. Let's think about this, right? And so diplomacy is even, in the solving of the Revolutionary War. The Treaty of Paris is concluded in 1783. And the United States is operating under the Articles of Confederation. I think this is something that teachers will talk about a lot in the classroom, right? Why did we need a constitution? That's really important. We were governing under this system. Why do we need a constitution? That plays throughout this entire crisis, because after the Revolutionary War is over, what does the United States have? They have no money. They owe France a ton of money. They don't really have any friends, right? Which is a problem if you don't have friends around the world. They have a government that is not strong enough to raise revenue. They have a lot of problems. And they start to try to apply all of the principles that they had fought so hard to gain in the Revolutionary War in their commerce. Oh, Adam Smith, Wealth of Nation. We got this. Free trade, right? We're just going to sit out on our ships, and we are going to sail into the Mediterranean Sea, and we're going to trade, and we're going to be wealthy, and it's going to gain, prosperity, all this other stuff. Well, they try this in 1785, because of course they've lost the protection of the British Navy. They're like, you want to be independent and on your own? Yeah, good luck with that, right? Good luck with that. The French had promised to protect some of these ships, what they did for a little while, but there's trouble brewing in France in the 1780s. And an American ship is captured in 1785. And some roughly 22 ships are captured, rather, and some 20 sailors are taken hostage, and they are held in Algiers. And this causes like a little bit of a minor uproar. The United States didn't have embassies. Like, they don't really have any consulates all around the world. They've got Adams and Jefferson. Adams is over in Great Britain as a minister. Jefferson's over in France. They have this flurry of letters. They're talking. There's no Secretary of State, right? This is still under the Articles. They're like, what do we do? Do we buy him back? Like, do we try to negotiate a treaty? And Congress is trying to talk about this, but they're involved in all the thinking about we need a constitution, and nothing gets resolved. So you have these guys who are there in Algiers just kind of like languishing for years, right? But there is a little brief period of time where the Portuguese will protect the American ships, because they really do want to do deals with the Americans. What happens is in 1793, the Portuguese sign an agreement with Algiers, saying that they will no longer guard the Strait of Gibraltar, and that these ships are free to sail out into the open Atlantic, and they're no longer going to guard that there. So this is a real problem. Almost immediately after that treaty is signed, 11 ships and 100+ citizens and seamen, because American citizens often traveled on these ships as well, going back and forth across the Atlantic. They're captured. And so everyone kind of gets absorbed into this, right? Like this is the crisis. You have to present the students with that flashpoint, right? And the other thing that I wanted to mention here, and that we went round and round about, with Nate, and Nate, please chime in here if you have any thoughts, is how we explain this idea between a pirate and a corsairs. Because the Americans, of course, are like, they're pirates. That is illegal. You cannot take our citizens. You cannot take our ships. You cannot do that. And the rest of the world is like, this is how the Barbary Nations make their money. Like, this has been going on for 200-300 years. Like, they are these states that are semi-autonomous from the Ottoman Empire. The Kingdom of Morocco has its own sultanate, but this is their means of getting revenue. Like, France and Britain and Spain were like, maybe get on board with this, pay them the tribute. Like, it's a lot easier than having to deal with it. This is just a commercial enterprise, nothing personal, right? It's just the way they do it. But the Americans are outraged. They want to create a new world order, what they see as the fruits of the revolution, the philosophy behind it. They're desperately trying to change that commercial order. And they can't do it. Like, they're not quite in that situation where that can be done.
Yeah. So what does it mean to pay tribute? Are they giving up? Are they giving in? And I guess, Allison, sort of on our side, I mean, you had lots of internal discussions about how to approach this and what to do.
Well, I was very concerned that because Algiers had the people, right, that gave them very much, power in the scenario. And Morocco had a pretty good relationship with the United States. They were the first country in the world to recognize the United States. They were never able to formally sign a commercial treaty. That was not signed over until 1786. But the Sultanate of Morocco very much wanted to have a good friendship. He saw this as a boon for his country, that they could have this maybe most favored nation, trading status, and to be like really the country in Africa, to have that special relationship with the United States. So Morocco is in a really kind of interesting situation, because they like the United States, they want to be friends with the United States, but also they don't want to alienate these other Barbary nations who are in competition with them. So we talked a lot about Tripoli and Tunis because they don't have any hostages, right? So they can't sort of use people like as this bargaining chip of power. But I think Nate, his research was so good because it helped us to understand, what these states really wanted. They needed agricultural things. They were not wealthy states. They were not really in the position just geographically to be able to just easily sail out and capture ships ahead of, Algiers. But they were looking towards their own trade with the Ottoman Empire. They were the ones geographically closest to them. And they also were very interested in doing business with the Italians. And so they often thought of themselves as being maybe the middlemen to things that they could get from the United States, then they could use that to ship out. And again, food stuff, wheat, so important here, And then in turn, the United States was actually looking for a lot of products from the Mediterranean to bring back, food things, olives, wine, all kinds of things. So we wanted to give Tripoli and Tunis, enough of a background and enough like hardcore things that they could bargain with. And they did want lumber, they did want nails, they did want ships, they did want to build up their own navies, but also very much for commercial reasons.
Yeah, so I just want to, for our participants to understand. So each student receives a scenario that sort of goes into the situation, and then in their specific small groups, each gets a roll sheet. And in that roll sheet is described sort of their perspective and their interests and suggestions on how they could approach this. And Nate, sort of incorporated into those roll sheets some of what Allison is just saying, sort of what they brought to the table. And as Nate says, sort of the red lines, what they will not do, but what they are willing to do. And then there was also included sort of what they were interested in terms of goods. So it gives students sort of a place to begin sort of a negotiation. I also want to add that once these go live on our website, teachers will be able to download the materials, but we will also have video clips, and the video clips will be of historians that teachers can play for the students as they prepare for the simulation. So there'll be short clips, less than 2 minutes, but several of them that will be directed at different stakeholder groups that will help students prepare for their role. And then there will be also clips of those historians sort of articulating what really happened, because I think we're making the point, as Nate said, to these students, we're not asking you to play it as if it, as it happened. What we want you to do is for you to take on this challenge yourself as a diplomat, but within this historical context. And I think, as Allison has described so well, these stakeholders here, for us, it's kind of giving them the nuances. It's not just the backdrop, it's the nuances of how they kind of feel about each other and sort of the relationship that they have with each other. And where Morocco does have that really unique position because it's friends with the United States, it has a treaty, but its neighbors are Algiers and Tunis and Tripoli. So where the video clips of the historian will help students to kind of better understand the nuances that will help them in building those relationships through those negotiations.
Was that our last slide, Lauren?
Oh,
Oh yeah, right. We put in some
the
maps.
map. So you can see
I
that's Strait
know.
of Gibraltar.
Well, I feel like, we're all on the same page with this, that with, I think, all the materials that we put together, you have to give them maps. It's not good enough to say like, well, Tunis and Tripoli, they're really interested in looking towards the east because they're closer. Like, you have to show them, And for a while we kind of messed around with the 18th century, early 19th century maps. They're too hard to read. It's just like the drawings. So I feel like, these are a bit more clear, and then the instructors can kind of talk it out, and it really shows them the breadbasket, like, if you were, of the Mediterranean. Like, when you are trading here, think of all the countries, that you can establish relationships with, and think of how vulnerable vulnerable you are if you once you go through that Strait of Gibraltar till you get to Constantinople. There's no getting out, right? So you better be on decent terms. You better be able to fly your country's flag, through there. I mean, just like France and Spain and Denmark and Sweden, they all traded with the Barbary states. They all entered into the Mediterranean, but they paid the tribute. They flew the flag, they paid the tribute. It was an agreement. And, for the Barbary states, they thought, look, America, this is really simple. Like, we're happy to trade with you and not take your people, but there's a price, to be attached to that. So I think the map is really instructive, and I think that the teachers can really kind of talk them through just the basic geography.
And that, even though we're talking and our stakeholders are US, Morocco, Algeria, Tunis and Tripoli, that there's other countries that play into it also, like the Ottoman Empire. And so I think students realize that this is not just something that these 5 stakeholders, if we've written them here, are dealing with. This is something that impacts this part of the world, and that we are a part of a much bigger landscape. It's not often just between 2 countries. There's others that are impacted as well. And I think that's that cause and effect that really helps students see the impact of these things.
I think maybe we might have one more slide.
The trade routes there.
Yeah, this was kind of interesting because in all of our research, most of the maps that are out there and readily available for free use without, copyright permissions, are on the triangular trade, the transatlantic slave trade. it's really hard to find a map of the world that, just kind of just shows sort of these, commercial trade routes as well. And so, but I think it's an important part of the story because even during the early 1780s, the United States was looking to break into the China trade. So they were out in the Pacific. So the idea that they even wanted to go into the Mediterranean was something that they had been doing under the British Empire for years, right? And in areas that the British Empire currently held, such as current day India, Pakistan, even into the Middle Eastern, countries, that it was a world that the United States had a little taste of under the empire, but now it needed to figure out how it was going to do it as an independent nation. And you could not do that without diplomats. You could not do that without diplomacy. You could not do that without formalizing agreements.
Right, which gives us to how this simulation reveals the role of the State Department and the impact of diplomacy.
And the necessity for having physical locations and consuls and people, right? They had a consul in 1784 in Canton, for instance, because that trade was considered so important. And so, afterwards and after this is resolved with the signing of treaties in 1796, 97, Americans would go and they would serve as consuls in those countries. And the part of the story that I think like the students really love to hear, they're like, oh, well then why did we have those wars? Why did Jefferson use that navy to fight those wars? And it's, well, the United States stopped paying the bill. This would become such a flashpoint, even after the Constitution is signed, Congress has the authority to get revenue. I mean, all those treaties combined, if the Americans really ponied up what they had agreed to pay to all these nations, it was 20% of the annual revenue.
Yeah, it's a lot. Yeah,
right. And
crazy.
John Adams' administration, they already appropriated money for the Navy too. So Congress is like, oh my gosh, it's going to bleed us dry.
Mhm.
And then you had so many people in that sort of Jefferson Republican, camp who were saying, what's the famous outcry? No tribute. We'd rather have war than pay tribute, something like that. That starts to come up. I mean, there's a reason why John Adams doesn't serve a second term, right? And this is one of them, that this is very unpopular and it's really unsustainable. So what, I don't know, they just kind of love to hear like, oh, wow, so the United States, like they kind of broke the deal, right? It's like, yeah, by 1800, they were already in arrears. Like, they owed on the rent. They weren't paying, so which kind of, causes this crisis that will continue for another year.
So the other thing, I think when students engage in our simulations, there's the short-term goals, things that can be decided quickly and out of need because something needs, there's a crisis unfolding, so some decisions have to be made immediately. And then there's also often these long-term goals. And I think with this simulation, the short term is sort of the hostages and what do we do and how do we get them back? And then there's also sort of the longer term of like trade and how do we fix this tribute problem, right? How do we make it so our ships can travel safely? And so maybe Allison, can you talk about a little bit about the hostages and why by the hostages being taken, what was that signal back to the merchants and those that were traders? What was that signal back to them in the United States?
Boston, Philadelphia, Charleston, New York merchants are panic stricken because even if their friends and relatives paid the ransom, they wouldn't get their ships back, right? So the person could go back, I mean, like I said, this was just business for these corsairs. And maybe I didn't make that distinction too.
Yeah, you did.
Well, the reason why it's important to explain them as corsairs is because they are not these independent actors. They are state sanctioned corsairs, meaning that they will use their own ships. Like you have a guy, he's got a ship, got sailors, they'll go and capture a ship. They got to give the ruler of their state some of that money, and then they get to keep the rest, right? So
They're like Uber drivers.
yeah, okay, right, exactly,
Yeah, it's
right.
kind of, yeah.
And you
Use your own thing. Yeah.
that, right? But eventually you pay the, the person who you were sort of like under. And the Americans, like, they just want to make that distinction at all. They're just like, no, this is piracy. So I'm sorry, Lauren, what did you ask me before?
Well, I mean, just where the fact that there's hostages has everyone so freaked out that it's just like, how is this going to impact their economy? I mean, this was, in fact, the crisis point for the
Well,
US.
I could say that the United States was extremely lucky that the French and the British were engaged in a war, because had they entered into, if the British had any idea that they could retake those colonies, like that was the time to do it. Like this was one of the weakest points,
Interesting. Yeah.
In America,
Yeah.
and the most vulnerable too. And so, as I said before, there had been guys languishing there since 1785, but they were they were they were laborers, they were forced laborers, right? That's how they used them. They would put them into a compound, and then they would be forced to work, right? But there was an opportunity for you to actually carve out a bit of your own entrepreneurial life in this, and this is what a couple of the Americans would do. So one guy, his name was James Leander Cathcart. He was a young kid when he was captured, and he was pretty savvy. And so when he was in this compound, he actually opened up a little restaurant in the compound. They were able to receive money, and he works his way up through his various entrepreneurial schemes to where he becomes the secretary to the Dey of Algiers, who's the ruler of Algiers. So by 1793-94, here you have this American who's a secretary. So he understands Arabic. Of course, he speaks English. Like, who better could be the go-between, right, when they start these negotiations? And so part of the really interesting part of the story is that here you have this guy, the Dey of Algiers, like, he doesn't want to talk to that American who came over. Like, he doesn't know that guy. He doesn't want to talk to him directly because he doesn't see him as his equal. So he doesn't want to deal with him. So he's got Cathcart kind of running back and forth, like, oh, well, the Dey says, he wants $2 million. The Americans are like, we don't have $2 million, go running back, and so they kind of are working diplomacy themselves, like in like their interest to make this deal happen. But Cathcart is so interesting because he knows how far the Dey will go and tries to explain that to the American, and they don't want to hear it. And they're just like, look, I've been here for 11 years. Like, I've been on the ground. I understand him. Like, I know what's going on. Like, you have to listen to me. And that's why it's so important even today for our diplomats to have their ear on the ground in almost so many ways, so they can communicate back to Washington.
Yeah.
What's really going on.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I'm just mindful of the time, and I'm wondering if there's anything Nate, is there anything in the Q&A section?
Oh, nothing additional. Someone asked about historical context and how we provide that for students, and I talked about the videos, which you then mentioned, which was also, the videos we have with historians was another great opportunity to impress on the themes that Allison was talking about, that the Corsairs saw themselves as legitimate, not pirates. The Europeans saw it as legitimate. It was just part of doing business in the Mediterranean. And it's the Americans who are up in arms about these supposed attacks and these criminals, when everyone else sort of sees it as, well, this is just the way thing is done. So it's one of those great things, I think, in history, especially for students, is they encounter something that's like, well, this is bizarre. These pirates work for the state, and that everyone thinks it's a lot, or at least a lot of people think it's okay. And you understand, you try to communicate the context of, yes, that was part of doing business as a merchant at that time, that was assumed to be part of the process.
And just to add that when we test driving these simulations really gives us, and the student feedback gives us, not only an idea of how to tweak the materials that they read, but their questions. In several of the pilot tests, we had Allison speak to the group, and then another historian speak to when we did the Spanish-American War. hearing the students' questions of the historian has been very helpful in us determining what questions to ask the historian in their interview and the clips to put on our website. So we have a sense of kind of what students are interested in. And again, it's kind of giving them insight into those nuances of the relationship that, so not only do they have the role sheets to help craft their priorities of what they want to accomplish, but by having a little understanding of the relationship between the stakeholders has also been very important for them.
We have another great question, Lauren, in the chat. It's, what is the typical time frame for class to complete one entire simulation? Is this a one class period? I know you've tested these with students. How long does it usually take teachers and students to get through one of these?
That's a great question. And I mentioned that we originally, had designed these for an in-class experience, which the way we've done, they can absolutely still happen as an in-class experience, but we've been doing them virtually. And in both cases, I could say it's true. All what needs to happen is that the teacher needs to first kind of prep the students, give them materials, get them into those stakeholder groups, give them their role sheets, maybe play the clips. So you need to make sure the students kind of are prepared in the information and the content. And then for the simulation itself, you really only need about 2 hours or a classroom. I mean, I've done them and actually slightly less, but even I think 90 minutes. So if you had a 90-minute to a 2-hour slot, I think that's perfect as long as the students are prepared. I even conducted one of our sims, and I believe it was the Spanish-American War, where we did 45 minutes, one half, and this is all virtual, 45 minutes, and then the next class was 45 minutes, and we finished it up. So that's another model. So you need about 90 minutes to 2 hours as long as the students are prepped.
I think though too, Lauren, because I think what most high school classes are like 45 minutes or something.
Well, it
like
depends. Because that was a high school class, and I did one that was 2 hours. He had 2 hours.
Because there are, the way that the simulations are crafted, the students, they go off and negotiate, then they come back into a larger group. So there's logical breakpoints where it's not that big of a deal to like, okay, well, let's leave it here. And when we pick it up, this
Right.
you done last time. And so you can spread it out, I think, over like even 2 or 3 days. Like
That's right. So the flow, to her point, the flow is in virtual, there's 3 moves. There's a chat room that's just kids preparing in their stakeholder group. So it's in a chat room. Then there's the formal conversation facilitated by the teacher, everyone looking at each other in Zoom. And then another chat room where you have one member from every stakeholder group in a negotiating room, which is a chat room. And they're pursuing their interests and they're negotiating. And it's a flow between the 3 moves. So to Allison's point, yeah, it's easy to kind of stop it and continue the next day.
Got another really good question from the chat from James. Are there any adjustments you've made to support students with disabilities, such as blind, deaf, autism, etc.? I would say, I can take the first crack at this one, is this is something I usually think about whenever I make any kind of materials, and which is why I really like the fact that we have video as the supplementary kind of material for this that can provide the context. So there's so much that you could potentially have students read about historical context, but that really then limits who is going to get the most benefit from it. And that really becomes a kind of a barrier for lots of students if you have them engage with large blocks of text. So I love the idea that historian videos are a part of this, and that makes it, I think, more accessible. And then also, one of the big accommodation factors that I build into all my activities is to make it group work. If you have students working in groups, there's just much more ability for the teacher to put in accommodations and to help out students to help out each other, which is an important part of learning these things as well.
Yeah, and it's all about group work for this, which is, I think, in part the success of it. I mean, it's not uncommon that I would engage students in their stakeholder group and one student is reading out loud to the other students the scenario and the role sheet. I think at some point in this, the information is important. Do not get me wrong. The scenario is important. The context is important. But at some point, you want the kids to step away and just step into those skills where they are really just, they know what they want, and then they have to really use those skills to try and get it, which is all about sort of relating to each other. So it's really important, the information at the top. And the other thing, as a facilitator and teacher, if I knew I was engaging with a class that needed some kind of an accommodation, I would tell the story of the scenario. So if and the way we've designed these materials, they're not long. I mean, I don't think our scenarios are more than, Nate, what? I don't think there's one that's 3 pages. I think it's
No, we
2.
tried to keep them to 1 to 2 pages.
Yeah, they're short.
Everything. Yeah,
They're short.
it could be done orally for sure.
It can be, right. And so I would tell the story, and then, yeah, I will give them the written to consult and look at. But at some point you want them to put that down and just kind of embody it and role play it. And I think that's where often I hear teachers say, wow, that kid never says a word. And now I'm seeing him or her take the lead here. Like, this is crazy. This is bizarre. And so where you really are asking them to step in and just put this emphasis on the skills and the diplomacy as well. So, yeah. We had thought, Allison, that maybe we would have, I think, going back to this, and after you had sort of offered some of that historical backdrop, like asking some feedback, because I mean, I think we were all like, oh, we're talking at you for 90 minutes. This is like, how can we make this interactive, which is what we do and want to do with our students. And it's hard in this webinar environment, but where we thought, well, you know, let's look at the, I think we had picked sort of the United States, Morocco, and Algiers. And if you were so when we invite students to open the simulation, they've prepared in their stakeholder groups and they prepare an opening statement. A minute, right? But, you know, what might that opening statement be for the United States, or Morocco or Algiers? And any thoughts that our listening audience may have about what an opening statement was, or what role would you like to play and why?
Right. Like we asked them just in 30 seconds to just kind of explain their position, maybe what they're looking for. So if you were playing the United States or Algiers or Morocco, what are some of the things that you would want the rest of the stakeholders to know in the opening statement before you start negotiating?
Feel free to populate the chat, which I cannot see. Is anything coming through?
No one has ventured a guess quite yet.
Or you can also just, if you want to go with that, or also just, you know, offer, do you think you would use this with your students? How and why? What course do you teach that you feel like, because it's not just the Barbary Pirates crisis. We also have, as Nate mentioned, the Spanish-American, which we are calling the Spanish and American conflict of 1898. And then because we want the students to step in before there's a war. And then we also have the Suez Canal Crisis, which interestingly enough is like sort of another port point, kind of like the Strait of Gibraltar. It's this canal, you know, and, you know, you think about how these waterways are so important, which kind of illuminates for students some of these foreign policy terms, you know, like the geopolitical, you know, impact of what's going on in a region. and why it's advantageous for any country to be a part of that. I mean, it helps to sort of open up, I think, some concepts that otherwise students might just feel are too difficult to understand or daunting, when in fact, it's accessible.
We have a question that popped up in the Q&A. I think it's a really good one too. Lisa asks, I teach undergraduates and I'm interested in the possibilities of using these simulations for undergraduates. Are there any modifications that you'd recommend to make to the activity to make it appropriate for older students? I know you've done a lot with the, I know that the hypothetical simulations have been used with students in higher ed as well. Is that,
Yeah,
is that
no,
right?
and to great success.
Mhm.
I think there's just one thing to know, which is these simulations are built to be done in no more than a 2-hour time frame. The information that each stakeholder has is enough to have, a really interesting, full, illuminating experience in 2 hours. These sims are not built to go on for 3 weeks where, because there's just not the information there, right? So with keeping with that, like keeping within the goal of what it is, it's to open your eyes to either the global issue, diplomacy, the skills, how this works, this moment in time where diplomacy was used, the role of the State Department or the United States. That's the goal, right? To open the eyes. It's not meant to be a deep dive into this part of history or, the Barbary Wars. That's not the point of this. It's just sort of to open their eyes to what diplomacy is and how it functions and works and the goals of it. So within it, if you do this, and it's absolutely appropriate for undergrads. There's no modifications that need, because I have found, even though I've done the same simulation with 8th graders, that I've done, the materials are the same with 8th graders that undergrad. It's so flexible that the class brings their own skill level to it. So if they're undergrads, their skill level is undergraduate skill level. So they're going to all show up with that same amount of background knowledge and skill level, and they're going to bring it to the exercise, and it's going to be a lot of fun, and they're going to learn a lot. I just did one of our sims this morning for young women who are in college, our HIV/AIDS sim hypothetical. They were brilliant. It was 2-hour time frame. They brought their great ideas. They talked about the skills that they used, and that's all, that's it. It's like this great little package that helps them to name some of these concepts. That's the goal. So absolutely, there's no modifications that I feel like you would need to make.
I never felt that either. And I was a professor for several years. And what I would do is probably give an assignment after it was over. And I would have them engage with primary documents. I'd have them look at the correspondence or the treaty and maybe attach an assignment to it.
And we have another great question. In crafting the simulations, what types of primary sources did you use, and which ones were the most useful? I mean, that's great. And the examples that I gave for the Barbary ones were incredibly useful because they had this great correspondence going back and forth about possible proposed negotiating positions and possible proposed money involved. And there's a great letter to Jefferson that put the dollar amount for each individual hostage, how much which would be redeemed, and that the ship captains and the more the higher born folks had a much higher price than the galley workers and the regular sailors, which was fascinating to see, and I think fascinating for students. And then in each case, it just really depends on the historical situation. There's a lot of, for the Spanish War, I mean, you can going on US press accounts, and then also kind of the back channels of the independence movements in Philippines and Cuba, which were very savvy about using the US press to their advantage. So in each case, I think it's really particular to the historical topic in terms of what primary sources were the most useful, but it's sort of finding the ones that I really looked for were the ones that were finding kind of that choice. Like what were maybe other options, what was possibly proposed as a solution, or suggested other avenues for resolving the conflict. Those were ones that I tended to look for and found really useful.
Yeah, sometimes reading the newspaper accounts about the capture of these ships, from like the Philadelphia newspapers, the Boston newspaper, like there's like the absolute outrage. It makes you wonder why there wasn't like another civil war. They're just like, who is going to stop this? Who is going to do something about this? Like they're just absolutely completely beside themselves. And, those were kind of interesting to read, as well as the letters that the United States government would write to the hostages in those long 11 years. It's always just kind of like, hey, just checking in, chin up, like we're working on it. And so you can read between the lines that there's this concern, but this inability to like just really do something about it. So that was kind of fun to look at that.
How are we doing? Let me look at the time. It's about 3 minutes till. I think we filled almost 90 minutes.
I think we did.
Incredible. So thank you for attending. As mentioned, these will all be on our website for free in June, starting in June. And we are so fortunate that one of the partners, National History Day, has made their competition theme for the school year of 2021-22. So this next academic year, the theme is debate and diplomacy. And so we're very much looking for, and we'll be promoting these resources heavily next year. And so keep checking back to our website where we're kind of adding additional resources to the sims that are there. And we're very interested to seeing how students kind of look at this theme of diplomacy and sort of build some projects the next year. So I think we're going to learn a lot about how our public understands diplomacy and how it connects to American history and what stories they may find interesting to them. And I think this is all really good information as we continue to build our permanent exhibits for our museum. So in the meanwhile, we're also very active on social media at Nomad Museum, and we host virtual programs several times a month. So look for that. And I know, I want to acknowledge Nate and the Center for History and New Media. Their website's incredible too, with all the different projects that they've been involved with as well.
We had one more question from James. James, did you want us to put up the code? Or just do the website?
There. That code?
Yeah, I think that one.
Okay.
Oh, just the website. Yep, diplomacy.
Yeah, .state.gov. Yeah. Keep checking that. We're on YouTube. We have Facebook. We have Twitter. And if you are teaching and you are interested in integrating the sims, whether the hypothetical or the historic, feel free, when you go to our website, there's a general email box, nomad@state.gov. Feel free to reach out to us and we can, make sure that you are feeling supported in integrating this program into your classroom, for sure.
Okay.
How are we doing? All right. Well, thank you all. And thank you, Nate and Allison. It's been really nice seeing and doing this with you. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks everyone for coming.
All right.
This was great.
Thanks everybody for coming. So I think, Lauren, you end the session. I saw from Leilani.
Oh, okay. All right, everybody. I want to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to end. Okay. We'll see you later. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.